Title: The Last Decision of Walter Greene Part 1. The Lonely Life of a Man Named Walter. Walter Greene lived alone in a modest, aging house in the quiet suburbs of Rochester, New York. Once, it had been a lively home, filled with laughter and warmth, but that was many years ago. His wife, Eleanor, had passed away from lung cancer 8 years earlier, and since then, the walls seemed to echo only with silence. Walter had once been a proud civil engineer, a meticulous man who took pride in every bridge, overpass, and foundation he helped design. He was known for his discipline, self-reliance, and methodical lifestyle. Even in retirement, he kept his routines sharp. He cooked his own meals, cleaned his home, and walked to the local grocery store every Friday morning. Over the decades, Walter had saved carefully and invested wisely, amassing a quiet fortune of over $4.6 million. But money was never his measure of life's worth. He lived simply, driving an old Ford, fixing his own leaky faucets, and clipping coupons even when he didn't need to. His guiding philosophy had always been, don't be a burden. Stand on your own 2 feet. That mindset had helped him through years of hard work and later through Eleanor's illness. He had refused help then, and afterward. He had never considered remarrying. The house, though creaky and drafty, was his sanctuary and his prison. His son, Daniel, lived in Boston, several hours away, with his wife, Rachel, and their 2 children. In recent years, visits had become rare. They used to come around Christmas or Thanksgiving, but as the years passed, phone calls replaced visits, and then silence replaced the phone calls. Walter didn't complain. He had raised Daniel to be independent, maybe too independent. He understood that people had their own lives, their own struggles, and he didn't want to impose. Still, loneliness crept in like rust on a bridge he'd once inspected, slow, inevitable, and corrosive. As Walter aged into his 80s, his body began to betray him. He could no longer walk long distances without pain in his knees, and a faint tremor in his hands made it harder to pour coffee without spilling it. His nights became longer, filled with fragmented sleep and distant memories of Eleanor's laugh, of his son's childhood, of blueprints and early mornings at job sites. One cold January morning, after a mild stroke left him dizzy and disoriented for several hours, Walter realized he needed help. It wasn't about pride anymore. It was about survival. He dialed Daniel's number with stiff fingers and waited as the phone rang. "Hey, Dad," Daniel answered, his voice distracted, background noise suggesting he was in the middle of something. "Everything okay?" Walter hesitated. "Daniel, I was wondering if maybe I could stay with you for a while, just until I get back on my feet. I had a small stroke, nothing major, but it scared me." There was a long pause. "I don't know, Dad," Daniel finally said. "I mean, we've got a lot going on. Rachel's mom is staying in the guest room. The kids are in school, and honestly, we're barely managing as it is. Maybe you should look into assisted living. There are some nice places near you, I'm sure." Walter felt something twist inside him. "I see," he said quietly. Rachel's voice came faintly in the background. Then Daniel said, "Rachel says the house is just too small. And she's right, Dad. You've always taken care of yourself. You'll figure this out." Walter nodded, even though no one could see. "Of course. Don't worry about it." He hung up and sat for a long time in the kitchen, sunlight slanting across the floor where Eleanor once used to kneel to water the plants. He wasn't angry, not quite. Disappointed, maybe. But more than anything, he felt invisible. That afternoon, he made an appointment with a nearby hospital's geriatric unit to talk about his options. It wasn't about giving up. It was about making sure he didn't die alone on the kitchen floor one day, only to be discovered by a neighbor days later. At the hospital, he met a young nurse named Emily Ross. She was in her late 20s, full of energy and warmth, and unlike most people, she spoke to Walter as though he mattered. Not as a patient, not as an old man, but as a human being with a life worth respecting. She asked him questions about his past, listened to his stories with genuine interest, and even joked with him when she saw how stubborn he could be about walking unassisted. Over the next several weeks, Walter returned for physical therapy and checkups, and each time, it was Emily who greeted him with a smile, who made sure he had his appointment sorted and his medication properly explained. When she called him Mr. Greene, it felt like more than a courtesy. It felt like he was seen. He never told her about the money. He never mentioned Daniel or Rachel again. But he began writing more in his journal, reflections about aging, pride, and the quiet erosion of dignity when people see you as a burden rather than a person. One evening, sitting by his window, watching the snow fall softly over the empty street, Walter picked up his old fountain pen and began to draft a new will. Part 2. The Will and the Silence. Walter Greene had never believed in grand gestures or dramatic declarations. He preferred order, precision, and quiet decisions. But as he sat in his living room, a thick beige blanket wrapped around his legs, and the sounds of winter muffled outside, he made the most important decision of his life, and perhaps the most uncharacteristic. He revised his will. The original version had left everything to his son, Daniel. It had been written shortly after Eleanor passed, in a moment of grief and duty. But now, that sense of duty had changed. It was not that Walter was vindictive, far from it, but what he had felt that day on the phone, that subtle rejection wrapped in politeness, had broken something. For a man who had spent decades building solid structures, feeling like an unstable afterthought was more painful than any physical ailment. Emily Ross had been, without meaning to, a foundation in his unsteady life these past few months. She showed up. She listened. She cared, even when there was no obligation. She reminded him of Eleanor in some small ways, gentle but sharp, kind but firm, and always alert to the emotional undercurrents most people ignored. That night, Walter wrote a letter along with a revised will. It read, "Asterisk to whoever finds this. My decision may come as a surprise to some, but not to me. I have chosen to leave my estate, all of it, to Ms. Emily Ross, not because of blood, but because of grace. She made me feel like a man again, not a task, not a patient. She reminded me that respect doesn't come from obligation. It comes from choice. I hope she uses this money for something meaningful, but she owes me nothing. Walter Greene asterisk." The following week, Walter had the will notarized and filed with his lawyer, an old acquaintance from his engineering days. He told no one. Not Daniel, not Rachel, not even Emily. His health began to decline more rapidly by early spring. His heart was weaker, the strokes more frequent. But he refused to be hospitalized full-time, choosing instead to stay at a local assisted living facility just outside the city where Emily still worked part-time. She often visited, bringing him fresh flowers or simply sitting beside him while he watched the evening news. "I'm not used to people being around this much," he once told her with a dry smile. "Well," she replied, "I'm not used to old men giving me a hard time every time I suggest they use a walker." They laughed together. It was a simple bond, born not out of obligation, but out of mutual dignity. Then one morning in late April, Walter didn't wake up. A nurse entered his room around 6:30 a.m. to find him peacefully slumped to one side, the book he had been reading still resting on his lap. The window beside his bed was cracked open, and a faint breeze stirred the curtains. He looked calm, at ease, as though he had simply slipped away during a moment of quiet reflection. There was no family at the bedside, no last words exchanged, but on the nightstand was a single folded piece of paper addressed to Emily. She arrived later that morning, tears rising before she even opened it. Inside, the note simply said, "Thank you for seeing me. W." The funeral was modest. A few of the facility's residents attended, along with Emily and one of the therapists from the hospital. Daniel and Rachel did not arrive until several days later, after they were notified by Walter's lawyer that the will was being executed. They came expecting the typical process, grieving formalities, perhaps sorting through old photos, and eventually inheriting the estate. But when they sat down with Walter's attorney, Mr. Franklin Walsh, the air shifted. "I want to begin by stating that your father's final will was made soundly, of his own volition, and with full legal clarity," Mr. Walsh began, his tone firm. Daniel furrowed his brow. "What does that mean exactly?" "It means," the lawyer said, sliding a copy of the will across the desk, "that Walter Greene left the entirety of his estate, valued at approximately $4.6 million, to a Ms. Emily Ross, a nurse who cared for him during his final months." Silence dropped like a stone in the room. What? Rachel said, leaning forward. That's got to be a mistake. Daniel's his son. I understand this is shocking, Walsh replied calmly. But the decision was final. He left a letter explaining his reasons, which I am authorized to share. He read Walter's words aloud, about dignity, about being seen, about respect over blood. Rachel's face flushed with anger. Daniel sat still, stunned. His voice, when it finally came, was barely more than a whisper. He left it all to a nurse. She was more than a nurse to him, Mr. Walsh said gently. She was someone who gave him comfort when he had no one else. They left the lawyer's office in silence, with none of the riches they had anticipated, and the sobering reality of their absence in Walter's final years trailing them like a shadow. Part 3. The Garden and the Legacy. The news of Walter Greene's unexpected bequest spread quickly. Emily Ross, a nurse in her late 20s, had already become a quiet local hero in the assisted living facility where Walter had spent his last months. But now she was thrust into the spotlight, though she remained as humble as ever. When she received the call from Mr. Walsh, Walter's lawyer, she was working the evening shift at the facility. The news stunned her, and at first, she didn't know how to react. Ms. Ross, I'm calling to inform you that Mr. Greene has left you his entire estate, Mr. Walsh said, his voice calm but authoritative. This includes his house, savings, and investments, as well as a significant amount of stock. Emily could only manage a soft "what?" in response, her mind reeling. The lawyer continued. He also left a letter explaining his reasoning. It was a decision made with full intent, and it's legally binding. I suggest you come by my office to discuss the next steps. When Emily met with Mr. Walsh a few days later, she was overwhelmed. She hadn't known Walter well enough to expect such a gesture. Yes, they had shared countless conversations, moments of laughter, and moments of quiet understanding. But this was beyond anything she could have imagined. Walter's decision, as outlined in his letter, was simple yet profound. He had chosen her, not because of anything she had done for him materially, but because she had respected him as a person. At his lowest, she had made him feel human again, something he hadn't felt in years, especially after his family had distanced themselves. There's a garden I'd like to see built in his memory, Emily told Mr. Walsh after reading the letter. A place that can be shared with the other residents at the facility, a space for reflection and peace. I want this to be something meaningful, not just for me, but for everyone. The lawyer nodded in approval. Walter's wish was for the funds to be used in a way that honored his life. He believed that respect for one's dignity was the greatest gift anyone could offer. I think the garden is a perfect tribute. Months passed, and the plans for the garden were set in motion. Emily used a portion of Walter's estate to transform a neglected corner of the facility's grounds into a lush, serene space. Local landscapers worked tirelessly, planting vibrant flowers, winding paths, and a small pond that mirrored the sky above. Benches were placed around the perimeter, each one engraved with small plaques honoring residents who had passed. In the center of the garden stood a large, smooth stone with Walter's name and the words, "He reminded us all that dignity matters." The residents loved it. It became a peaceful retreat, a place for quiet walks, reading, or simply sitting in the sun. The young nurse, who had been so kind to Walter, had created something that would stand as a testament to him, but also to the value of compassion and human connection. Meanwhile, Daniel and Rachel, still reeling from their father's decision, came to terms with the reality of their estrangement. The inheritance, which they had once expected to inherit, was gone. But more than that, they had lost something far more valuable than money: the chance to make amends, to connect with Walter before it was too late. They visited the garden in the fall, months after Walter's death. Emily had invited them, though she didn't expect them to come. When they arrived, they found her sitting by the pond, her hands folded in her lap, watching the ripples in the water. "Ms. Ross," Daniel said, his voice soft, I wanted to apologize. We didn't understand how much you meant to him." Emily looked up, her eyes kind but firm. "It wasn't about me," she said gently. "It was about your father finding someone who made him feel seen when he felt invisible. He never asked for your money, Daniel. He asked for your presence. Rachel, standing slightly behind her husband, nodded. We were wrong, she admitted, her voice thick with emotion. I don't think we realized how much we had failed him. There was a long pause. Emily stood up, brushing the leaves from her pants. I don't hold any resentment, she said. I believe Walter did what he needed to do. He chose to leave a legacy of kindness, not just through money, but through what that money could create. She motioned toward the garden. This is his legacy, and it's open to all of us. Daniel and Rachel didn't stay much longer. They walked around the garden, silently, before leaving. As they departed, Emily sat back down, alone for a while, reflecting on how life had a way of teaching lessons, often in ways one didn't expect. The garden became a sanctuary not just for the elderly residents, but for anyone who understood its true meaning. It was a place where people were not defined by their age, wealth, or family ties. It was a place that reminded everyone who came there of the power of respect and compassion, the kind of legacy Walter Greene had left behind. As the years passed, the garden flourished, and Walter's memory lived on in the hearts of those who had known him, not for his fortune, but for the way he had shown, even in the final moments of his life, that it was never too late to choose respect over resentment, love over neglect. The question Walter had asked in his last letter remained with Emily and everyone who visited the garden. Who will be there for you in your final moments? And though they couldn't answer it for Walter, they all found the answer for themselves in the quiet, peaceful corners of the garden he had left behind. If you enjoyed this story and would like to see more inspiring tales about the lives and experiences of older adults, make sure to like, share, and comment below. We'd love to hear your thoughts and any stories you'd like to share with us. Don't forget to subscribe to Elder Stories for more heartfelt content, advice, and reflections on aging, health, and life's precious moments. Hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. Thank you for being part of our growing community.